In a world lit by gaslights and hidden behind silk curtains, a woman dances in silence, her skin painted, her truth concealed beneath layers of illusion. A duke, haunted by grief, watches from the shadows, unaware his heart is moments from collision. Tonight, beneath the tents of a traveling circus in Savannah, a secret is about to ignite, a forbidden bond, a hidden past, a choice impossible to ignore. Will duty extinguish desire, or can one glance change destiny forever? Welcome, dear listener. Tell us, where in the world are you joining us from? And do you believe true love can conquer the rigid rules of society in a historical romance? Savannah, Georgia, early spring of the year 1843. The dusk had fallen slowly over the Savannah River, laying a veil of amber across the cobblestones and casting long shadows from the gas lamps that flickered to life one by one. The air was dense with the perfume of magnolias and the murmur of anticipation as townsfolk and travelers alike gathered near the docks where the traveling circus had pitched its tents. A crimson banner fluttered above the main pavilion, bearing gold-painted letters that read, "Erlking's Grand Menagerie of Marvels." Beneath its arch, jugglers spun fire, and tightrope dancers bowed low with painted smiles. But beyond the noise and color, beyond the laughter and scent of roasted peanuts and spiced rum, there was one name spoken in hushes, half believed, half feared: the painted bird. She was the final act, the one that silenced the children and made grown men lean forward without understanding why. Inside the grand tent, gaslight chandeliers shimmered above a circular stage bordered by velvet curtains. The crowd filled the seats in waves, merchants in linen coats, ladies with gloved hands and restless fans, sailors thick with rum, and debutantes clutching parasols like shields against their own curiosity. They came not to cheer, but to stare. Behind the curtains, Mireille stood barefoot upon the sawdust, her spine straight, her breath even. Her arms and collarbone were powdered and painted to conceal the soft marbled patches of her skin, though the paint never fully masked what she was. Her long chestnut hair had been brushed, oiled and laced with thin feathers that quivered as she inhaled. Her eyes, one green, one grey blue, caught the light like polished glass. She said nothing. She never did. A bell chimed 3 times. The curtain rose. The audience exhaled as one. She stepped forward, slow and liquid, the beaded hem of her emerald bodice shimmering with each controlled breath. Her gauze skirt floated behind her, sheer and uneven, the effect like wings in mid-molt. A hush spread across the tent like a spell. She moved not like a woman, but like a memory, fragile, half-forgotten, haunting. In the shadows above, seated in a private gallery set apart from the masses, Duke Everett Langford adjusted his gloves and leaned ever so slightly forward. He had not wanted to come. He had arrived in Savannah only that morning, the weight of transatlantic grief still clinging to his shoulders. He had traveled far from Wexcombe Hall not for distraction, but for distance, from memories that clung too tightly, from duties that pressed too closely. But his host, an American acquaintance with a fondness for spectacle, had insisted. "You must see her," the man had said. "She is unlike anything you've ever known." And so, Everett had come, prepared to endure. But when she stepped into the ring, his breath caught, low and involuntary. She moved without music, only the soft scrape of her soles against the floor and the rustle of silk. Each gesture was impossibly precise. The bend of her wrist, the tilt of her head, the moment she rose to the tips of her toes, as if reaching for a sky she'd never touched. Her arms curved like wings and then collapsed as though broken. She was sorrow in motion, beauty caged, and she danced as though the act of not speaking were a scream in itself. Everett felt it before he understood it. Not desire, not pity, something deeper, something primal, recognition. For a brief moment she turned. Her gaze swept the crowd like a tide, distant, mechanical, practiced, until it met his. 1 second, no longer. But in that second, her rhythm faltered. Barely, but enough for Everett to see it. Her lips parted, her body stilled, and though her expression did not change, her eyes did. They widened just so, like windows cracking under the weight of a storm. He did not blink. He could not. She turned away. The audience clapped, uncertain whether they'd seen brilliance or brokenness. The ringmaster stepped forward to declare her a miracle of nature, but his words fell flat. Everett remained seated long after the curtain fell. The noise of the crowd became dull, distant like rain on a faraway roof. In his chest, a heaviness shifted. A silence he had worn like mourning cloth stirred, as if the memory of loss had been startled awake by something living. He did not know her name. He did not know why her eyes unsettled him. But he knew, with the certainty of men who have buried too much, that something had changed. And she, behind the curtain, breathless and shaking, pressed her palm against her chest where the paint had cracked, and remembered what it felt like to be seen. The evening was heavy with mist and anticipation. Savannah's low-hanging skies, tinged with rose and pewter, mirrored the hush that had fallen over the riverbanks, where the circus tents stood like faded crowns atop the earth. The scent of pine tar and damp cottonwood hung thick in the air, mingling with the burnt sugar of kettle corn and the far-off rumble of wagons arriving with the final deliveries of the day. Inside the performers' quarters, a narrow wooden structure hastily erected behind the main pavilion, Mireille sat before a cracked mirror. Her posture was impeccable, shoulders pulled back, neck long, but the weariness behind her eyes betrayed her. With the gentleness of someone tending to old bruises, she dipped a cloth into lukewarm water and began removing the mask that made her more palatable to the crowd. The thick layers of white and ochre dissolved slowly under the damp cloth, exposing the truth of her skin. The constellation of marbled patches that danced across her cheek, her throat, the ridge of her collarbone. The contrast was stark, as though two worlds coexisted upon her body, one accepted by society and the other condemned to be hidden beneath powder and silence. She blinked slowly at her reflection. The woman staring back at her was not the painted bird. She was Mireille Rousseau, born of blood and bone, of fire and silence, and tonight she was tired. Beyond the thin wooden slats of the performers' quarters, the world moved. Horses neighed, children laughed in shrill bursts, a tambourine jangled, and somewhere, very near, a man exhaled. Unaware that he was holding his breath, Everett Langford stood beneath a gas lamp just past the rear entrance of the tent, his gloved hand resting absently against the carved head of his walking cane. He had arrived earlier than intended. The ticketmaster, caught off guard by his presence, had directed him to wait near the service side of the grounds while preparations were finalized. He had not expected to see her, but there she was. Not under gaslight, not in motion, not dazzling, but still, entirely still, unaware of any gaze upon her, stripped of costume and illusion. A young woman alone, wiping the paint from her cheeks with the patience of someone who had done so 1,000 nights before. And Everett could not look away. There was no beauty in the traditional sense to what he witnessed, no spectacle. What there was instead was truth, a bone-deep truth that pierced through him like winter air. Her face, now unmasked, was fragile and fierce all at once. Her hair had come partially undone, and strands clung to her damp temples. Her mouth was set not in sorrow, nor in seduction, but in resolve, as though she were preparing herself to be forgotten once more. For a fleeting moment, Everett considered stepping back, averting his gaze, offering her the decency of privacy. But he didn't, because something in her, something quietly defiant, something wounded but whole, held him there, not out of voyeurism, out of reverence. Inside the quarters, Mireille's fingers paused. She felt it, a prickle at the nape of her neck, not of fear, but of presence. Her eyes darted to the mirror and caught in the reflection of the warped glass the faint outline of a figure beyond the slats. She turned slightly, just enough to catch a glint of pale linen. A dark silhouette, the outline of a tall man under the lamplight. He did not shift. He did not flee. And unlike the others, those who watched her with hunger or pity, this one watched with stillness, with restraint, as though he were not discovering her but remembering her. She did not look away. The silence between them, separated by planks of rough wood and flickering shadows, stretched long and taut. A thread spun between two souls who had never spoken, never touched, but somehow already knew the timbre of the other's ache. Then, just as slowly, she resumed her task. Her hand dipped the cloth again, removed the last line of gold from her jaw. She set it down, stood, and vanished behind the back curtain. Everett remained where he stood, the lamplight warming one side of his face. He could still smell the faint hint of rosewater from her dressing area. The scent lingered in the damp air like a secret just confessed. Inside the circus office, lit by oil lanterns and thick with the smoke of cheap cigars, the ringmaster narrowed his eyes as he watched from behind a half-closed shutter. He had noticed the Englishman the night before, and again tonight. He was no fool. Turning away from the slat, he poured himself a drink and muttered under his breath, "They always think they can save the bird from its cage, but they never stay long enough to learn why the cage was built in the first place." Later, backstage, Mireille walked with measured steps toward the costumer's rack. The others were speaking in quick, nervous French, laughing too loud, their voices tinged with that edge performers wore like armor. She ignored them. Her dress for the night had been prepared. A deep indigo bodice with silver beading, a skirt of layered chiffon that shimmered like fish scales under the torchlight. She lifted it without comment and stepped behind a faded screen to change. As she dressed, her heart beat not faster but deeper, like a drum heard from the next room, the man from the gallery. He had returned, and this time he had seen her, truly seen her. No applause, no gaslight, no glitter, only her. She could still feel the weight of his gaze, not heavy, not invasive, but warm, like sunlight on a forgotten window pane. And for the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar curl at the edges of her ribs. Not longing, not fear, hope, brief, fragile, uninvited, but hope all the same. A knock sounded against the wooden beam. Mireille emerged, composed. The curtain call was near. The ringmaster stood before her, hands clasped behind his back, his face schooled into polite disdain. "You've caught the eye of a gentleman," he said softly, almost conversationally. "Don't let it climb to your head." She said nothing. He stepped closer. "You belong to the stage, girl. To me. They don't come for your soul. They come for your skin. Never forget that." Mireille looked up, her mismatched eyes meeting his with steady defiance. "I haven't forgotten," she murmured, her voice like the edge of a blade wrapped in silk. But even as she turned away, lifting her chin and stepping into the swirling heat of the performance corridor, a single thought took root and would not let go. Someone had seen her, unpainted, unpolished, unspoken, and he had not turned away. The morning unfolded in a hush of pale fog and solemn bells. Savannah stirred slowly, as though reluctant to part from the dreams of the night. The river rolled in silence, grey and drowsy, and the streets glistened with the faint sheen left by the previous evening's dew. Market vendors set out their baskets, the scent of bread mingled with coal smoke, and the town resumed its rhythm, unaware that in one shadowed corner of its existence something fragile had begun to awaken. In his lodgings on Bay Street, Everett Langford stood before the window, his silhouette outlined by the grey morning light. He held in his gloved hand a worn, leather-bound volume. Jane Eyre, the pages softened by years of touch, the spine still strong. His thumb brushed the edge of the cover, not as a reader, but as a man about to surrender something that had once brought him solace. A book he had kept through grief, a story of a woman who refused to be erased. He had chosen it not as a gift, but as an offering. On the inside cover, he slipped a folded note of cream-colored paper. The ink, though carefully penned, revealed hesitation in its curves. No signature, no claim. Only a single question. Do you remember your name before the paint? He did not know what compelled him to write it, only that he had to. The silence between them, that glance exchanged behind the performer's quarters, had lingered with the persistence of perfume on skin. Something in her gaze, quiet but searing, had touched a place he thought buried forever, a place untouched even by morning. He closed the book, wrapped it carefully in a square of indigo silk, and summoned a boy from the stables to deliver it. No names, no explanations. Only this: to be placed where the bird sleeps. The boy raised his brow but took the package without question. That evening, Everett did not attend the performance. He could not bear to watch her from a distance while the ink of his own words waited to be unfolded by hands he had not yet earned the right to touch. Instead, he paced his quarters, every sound from the street below testing his nerves. He imagined her opening the parcel, imagined her fingers brushing the worn pages the moment her eyes found the note. Would she understand the question for what it was? A quiet rebellion against the world that had stripped her name from her lips? Or would she burn it? The following night, Everett returned to the circus. Not to the gallery, but to the lowest row of the amphitheater, half shrouded by the curtain's edge. He sat still, his gaze fixed not on the stage, but on the side corridor where performers slipped in and out. The crowd swelled with noise around him, laughter and whispers and snapping fans. But his ears caught only the beating of his own heart. She appeared as she always did last, but tonight something had changed. There was something different in the tilt of her chin, the stillness of her eyes. She moved as if carrying a secret in her chest, light and perilous. Her hands were steady, her breath smooth, yet her gaze swept once across the crowd and paused. Everett did not move. He did not dare. But her eyes found him, and for one brief incandescent instant, they remained. And then she turned. It was enough. Later, after the crowd had thinned and the torches had burned low, Everett lingered outside the tent, uncertain whether to leave or to wait like a fool beneath the gas lamp. He had not noticed the girl approach until she was right in front of him. A child of no more than 10, barefoot and quick-eyed, holding a folded scrap of white fabric between her fingers. She said nothing, only held it out. He took it carefully, nodding once in thanks. By the time he looked up again, she was gone. The cloth was plain, perhaps torn from an old petticoat. Upon it, in tiny stitches of midnight blue thread, one word had been sewn with aching precision: Mireille. He closed his fingers around it as though it were a flame. That night, Everett did not sleep. He sat at his writing desk, the makeshift thread of her name resting beside his inkpot, and began a letter. Not long, not florid, but true. You do not owe me words. You do not owe me anything. But if you will allow me, I will speak plainly. Not as a nobleman, not as a spectator, only as a man who has forgotten how to remember. If you do not wish me to write again, send back this page folded once. If you allow it, send it back folded twice. Nothing more. He waited until morning to send it. A flower vendor agreed to deliver it in secret exchange for a coin and silence. 2 nights passed. The third evening, Everett returned to his seat near the side of the tent. The performance unfolded as it always did, with gaslight and music, with acrobats and animals and cries of wonder. But Everett saw none of it, until she came. Her costume shimmered silver that night, and her skirt caught the torchlight with every turn. Her body arched through the air like a ribbon caught in the wind, but her expression never changed. She was far from the crowd, far from the noise, and yet, when she passed near the edge of the ring, her gaze dipped for just a second. She was carrying a fan. She opened it casually during a pass. Everett's heart stilled. Inside, he saw his note, folded twice. Their correspondence began in secret, hidden between the folds of old pages and behind cracked floorboards. Sometimes she responded in lines copied from books, sometimes in pressed flowers wrapped in paper. She never signed them, but he always knew. She told him things in her own way, of a garden she remembered from childhood where jasmine grew wild, of the rain in summer, how it made the circus smell of rust and sugar, of her dreams, not of grandeur but of silence, of waking without being watched. Everett answered with sketches of England's coastline, memories of music halls, bits of poetry. He wrote not to rescue her but to witness her. He sent no gifts, no promises, only his presence, carved onto paper, inked in reverence. Their words never named what was building between them, but it was there, in the tilt of a phrase, in the echo of a metaphor, in the careful way she had stitched her name with thread and given it to him, not with a voice, but with trust. Mireille never allowed herself to hope for freedom, but something inside her had softened. For the first time in years, she had begun to wait for something, not for applause, not for rescue, but for the quiet of a letter folded twice. The night had arrived cloaked in velvet, windless and thick, with the scent of scorched oil and overripe magnolias. All of Savannah seemed to hold its breath as the final hour of the circus approached. The crowd swelled beneath the big top, every seat taken, every eye expectant, every voice subdued by anticipation. Tonight's performance was to end with La Danse de Feu, the most perilous act in the Painted Bird's silent repertoire. 3 burning rings would be suspended above the arena, turning slowly, their flames fed by the perfumed oil that licked the air with sweet danger. It was an act reserved for the final evening of the week, meant to leave the audience breathless and bewildered. Mireille stood behind the curtain, already cloaked in heat, her skin powdered and glistening beneath the thin layers of gauze and sequins. Her costume shimmered gold and crimson, the bodice tighter than usual, laced so high it pinched her ribs. Tiny feathers, tinted copper, had been threaded into her braid, which now coiled tightly at the base of her neck. Her bare arms caught the torchlight. No paint tonight could hide what she was, but the ringmaster had decided it added to the mystery, the danger of it. "She is the flame," he had whispered to the audience before retreating. But Mireille did not feel like fire. She felt brittle, stretched, like old silk left too long beneath the sun. The orchestra struck its first note. The curtain swept aside, and she walked into the ring as the audience fell into reverent silence. In the gallery, Everett watched with narrowed eyes, his chest constricted by something he could not name. He had not been told of the fire act, had not prepared to see her step so close to danger, so close to the edge between wonder and ruin. Her body moved as though drawn by invisible threads. She glided into the circle of flames, lifted herself in a single breath onto the small platform, and waited. Then, as the rings began to spin, she began to dance. It was not the elegance of her usual performance. It was faster, fiercer, stripped of grace, and layered instead with urgency. Her arms reached toward the rings, her feet spun and swept and kicked sand into the fire. Sparks rose around her like living stars. Then it happened. Her foot caught on the hem of her skirt, a twist, small but sudden. The third ring swayed too far inward. The edge of her sleeve grazed the flame. A gasp rippled through the audience. The ringmaster stood up. Everett did not think. He rose, pushed past startled ushers, and leapt over the railing into the dust of the arena. He reached her just as she staggered backward, catching her by the waist and pulling her away from the flame, which licked the empty air where she'd been only seconds before. For one suspended moment, she stood in his arms. Her eyes, wide and wild, stared up at him with something between fury and wonder. The tent burst into noise. The ringmaster appeared with 2 clowns at his side, waving his arms. Everett stepped back slowly, hands raised in apology, eyes never leaving hers. She did not move. Only when she was ushered backstage did her limbs resume their trembling. The crowd erupted in scattered applause, confusion mingling with admiration, scandal with concern. Inside the performer's corridor, the ringmaster's fury came swift and sharp. "You humiliated me," he hissed, slamming the door shut behind her. You think he's your savior now, do you? You think he'll carry you off to some mansion and call you his duchess?" Mireille said nothing. "Answer me," he barked, grabbing her arm. She flinched, but held her chin high. Her silence was louder than any scream. He slapped her, not hard but with precision, a reminder, a brand. "You belong to this tent," he seethed, "and as long as I draw breath you will dance when I say how I say, with whatever damn fire I light beneath your feet." When she was finally left alone, her face throbbed, her palm was burned, and her ribs ached from where the corset had crushed against her during the fall. But worse than all of that was the feeling in her chest, that molten, unbearable sensation that had started the moment he caught her. She did not weep, she did not speak. She simply dressed in silence, wrapped a wool cloak over her shoulders, and left the tent through the rear flap as midnight struck. Everett waited in the garden of his inn, the one tucked behind the row of rosewood houses, where the gaslights burned softer and the hedges whispered in the wind. He did not know if she would come. He had sent no message, made no demand. He had only waited. And then he heard it, a soft rustle of fabric, a footfall on gravel. He turned. She stood beneath the arch of ivy, barely visible in the moonlight, her cloak wrapped tightly around her. Her face was half-shadowed, but he could see the mark blooming on her cheek, the tear in her sleeve, the bruise on her dignity. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. It was the first full sentence he had ever heard her speak aloud. His throat tightened. "I'm glad you are," he said simply. They stood in silence. The garden smelled of night jasmine and cold stone. A breeze passed between them, stirring the edge of her cloak and the tail of his cravat. "I didn't mean to fall," she murmured, eyes lowered. "I didn't mean to run to you," he replied softly. She lifted her gaze. "I could be punished for this," she said. "I believe you already have been." He stepped forward, not abruptly but with a gentleness that a man reserves for something he is afraid to break. He reached for her hand, slowly, letting her see the movement, letting her choose. When their fingers touched, she did not pull away. He turned her hand over in his palm, examining the burn, his thumb barely brushing the edge. She inhaled sharply, not from pain, but from the heat of his skin on hers. No man had touched her like this. No man had dared to hold her hand as though it were sacred. She closed her eyes. In that moment something passed between them, not desire, not promise, something deeper, recognition. As if they had known each other once, long ago, before the world taught them to speak in silence and to love without hope. When she opened her eyes again, he was still there, still holding her hand, still looking at her like she was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen, not because she had danced through fire, but because she had survived it. She stepped back, slowly withdrawing her fingers, though the warmth lingered. "I should go," she said. "May I see you again?" he asked. Her eyes searched his, and then, with a voice that trembled like candlelight, she replied, "You already do." The morning light in Savannah had an edge that day, a sharpness hidden beneath its usual softness, as though the very air knew that something unspoken had begun to stir. The gas lamps were still being extinguished as carriages clattered over cobblestones and lace-trimmed parasols bloomed like white petals against the sky. But within the drawing rooms of the city's finest homes, behind silk curtains and china teacups, whispers were already blooming faster than the garden roses. They spoke not of war, nor of crops, nor of European news. They spoke of her, the strange girl from the circus, the one who had danced through flames and fallen into the arms of a man far above her station, the one whose eyes had lingered far too long upon a duke. No name had been spoken aloud, not yet. But Everett Langford's absence from respectable society had begun to speak for him. He had not attended the most recent dinner at the governor's mansion, nor the reading club at Mrs. Prescott's, nor Sunday service. Instead, he had been seen walking the edges of the riverbank, slipping into alleyways behind the pavilion, speaking with vendors beneath the tented shadows. The scandal was no longer a whisper. It was a rising hum. And across the ocean, in the cold, immaculate study of Wexcombe Hall, his solicitor sat hunched over a desk, penning a letter that would cross the Atlantic with urgency. The family name, the inheritance, the estate, everything was tied to discretion, to propriety, to the unyielding code of what was done and what was never done. To consort with a circus girl, a performer, a curiosity, unforgivable. The letter, though polite in its phrasing, carried a blade beneath every line. If Everett did not cease his misguided attentions, the trustees would move to place his inheritance under protective hold, and if rumors of romantic involvement proved true, the matter would reach the House of Lords. Back in Savannah that very morning, the letter was delivered to Everett's hands with the kind of silence reserved for funerals. He opened it without ceremony, eyes scanning each line with a detachment that would have frightened anyone who knew him well. When he finished reading, he folded it neatly, set it on the mantel, and stared at the fire for a long time. But he did not weep, nor rage, nor write a reply. He simply thought of her, of the woman with firelight on her skin and silence in her bones. And somewhere else, hidden behind canvas and sawdust, that same woman was discovering something of her own. Mireille had been assigned the task of organizing the back ledgers, the endless stack of records the ringmaster kept in old trunks beneath his office. They were yellowed and brittle, reeking of mildew and dried ink, pages marked with numbers, with names, with transactions she dared not interpret. She worked quietly, sorting them into crates, her fingertips smudged with ash and dust. It was as she was lifting one of the final ledgers that the spine cracked and something fell from between its pages. A photograph. It was curled at the edges, worn with age. The ink had faded, but the image remained. A little girl, perhaps 4 or 5, standing stiffly beside a tall woman dressed in embroidered silk. The child wore a white smock and held a bouquet of wildflowers. Her hair, darker than it was now, hung in thick curls past her shoulders. Her eyes, wide, solemn, mismatched, looked directly at the camera. Mireille felt the air catch in her chest. It was her. She turned the photograph over with trembling fingers. Scrawled in faded ink, barely legible, daughter of R.L. Rousseau, France, 1820. Her knees gave way before she knew she had moved. She sank to the floor, photograph clutched in her hands, her breath shallow. Her entire life had been a ghost story, a myth of shadows. But now here, in her palms, was proof that once, before the paint, before the feathers, before the cage, she had belonged somewhere. She was not nameless. She was not born of the circus. She was someone's. The creak of the door behind her sliced through the silence. She rose slowly, turning toward the figure that loomed in the doorway. The ringmaster. His eyes, dark and unblinking, fell upon the photograph. "So," he said, his voice low, "you found it?" Mireille said nothing. She held the image tight to her chest as though it might vanish. He stepped forward with deliberate calm. "I wondered when that would surface. Should have burned it. But I always did have a taste for souvenirs." Her jaw tightened. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was a whisper sharpened by disbelief. "Why keep this from me?" He gave a humorless laugh, crouching near a crate. "Because you were worth more without it. A girl without history, a blank slate. That sells far better than a bastard daughter of a French merchant and his housemaid." Her breath caught. "Your mother was paid off," he went on, almost idly. "The man was rich, couldn't risk a scandal. She fled to the Americas, brought you with her, died in childbirth or something close. You were sold into our hands by the midwife who buried her." He looked at her, head tilted. "You were never meant to be found, Mireille Rousseau." Her name on his lips sounded like poison. "You're not just a freak," he hissed. "You're a scandal waiting to erupt. If the press knew who you really were, imagine the headlines, the lawsuits, the disgrace to his name." She clutched the photo tighter. "So you erased me," he smiled. "I painted you." She stared at him, trembling. A storm of grief and rage coiled inside her, but she would not let it rise. Not here, not now. She turned and walked past him, refusing to let her steps falter. She would not let him see her break. Back in her quarters, she lit a single candle and set the photograph beside her makeshift mirror. The child in the image stared back, solemn and small, as if asking to be remembered. Mireille touched her own face, the cheek still marked by the echo of a slap, the skin pale beneath the powder. She looked at the photograph, then back at her reflection. "I remember you now," she whispered, "and I will not forget again." And far across the city, in the hush of his rented room, Everett sat beside the firelight, fingers curled around the edge of her latest note. There were no words written, only a pressed sprig of jasmine folded between the paper, its scent soft and persistent, like her, like the truth that no longer fit inside a cage. The rain had come suddenly, without thunder or ceremony, cloaking Savannah in a soft, steady hush that muffled the sounds of the world. Drops pattered gently against the shutters of Everett Langford's lodging, tracing crooked paths down the glass panes like wandering memories. The morning had not yet broken fully, and the streets were half empty, save for vendors covering their wares and horses shuffling uneasily under the dripping eaves. Inside his room, Everett stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, his thoughts heavier than the storm outside. He had spent the night turning over possibilities like worn coins. Each scenario brought him to the same conclusion, however unpalatable. Mireille would never be free so long as she remained in the hands of the man who caged her. And words, letters, glances, even the tentative unfolding of hearts would never be enough. So he had requested a meeting, not with her, with him. The ringmaster had agreed, though not without mockery. They met in a private room behind the rear of the circus compound, thick with the scent of tobacco and wet straw. A single oil lamp swung above the desk, casting shadows against the canvas walls. Everett refused to sit. "I wish to negotiate Miss Rousseau's release," he said, voice even. The ringmaster chuckled, his smile thin and cutting. "She's not for rent, my lord. She's for spectacle. I'm prepared to offer a sum that will compensate you for her absence." "Oh, I've no doubt of that," the man replied, leaning back in his chair. "But it isn't about money. It's about control. I own what the audience desires. I own what they cannot look away from. And what they cannot look away from," he added with a glint in his eye, "belongs to me." Everett's jaw clenched. "I will not leave without terms." The ringmaster studied him for a long moment, then rose and walked to a small cabinet. He pulled out a decanter and poured himself a drink. He didn't offer one. "All right," he said finally. "Let's talk terms." But what followed was not negotiation. It was degradation wrapped in civility. A proposal laced with humiliation. Mireille, he implied, was not just to be purchased, but used, broken down, dressed up, paraded one last time. Her freedom would come only after one final performance, choreographed not for the crowd, but for the buyer's ego. Everett's blood turned cold. "I won't allow it." "You don't have a choice," the man hissed, leaning in close. "You think you're saving her. You're turning her into gossip, into scandal. The world won't open its arms for her. It will tear her apart. You'll be doing her more harm than I ever have." Everett left without another word. Outside, the rain had turned into mist. The city was blurred at the edges, softened by water and sorrow. He walked through the alleys, with no destination, his gloves soaked, his heart a storm louder than the one above him. It was Mireille who found him that evening. She had received word, whispers of his attempt to purchase her, and though her heart twisted with something close to tenderness, it twisted harder with fury. She waited for him where she knew no one else would come. An old chapel, abandoned at the edge of town, its roof half collapsed, its pews rotting, its altar faded by time and dust. But it still held silence like a sanctuary. She stood beneath the arch where once a door had been, her cloak clutched at her throat, her eyes hard and gleaming with unshed tears. He arrived breathless, startled to see her. and even more startled by the fire in her gaze. "You went to him," she said. "No greeting, no preamble." "I did. You tried to buy me." He stepped forward. "I tried to free you." She took a step back. "Do you think that's different?" Rain dripped from the broken ceiling, collecting in stone grooves along the floor. He reached for her, then stopped. "I didn't know what else to do," he said quietly. "You think I haven't spent years being bartered? Watched men look at me and wonder how many coins I was worth?" Her voice cracked, but she didn't falter. "You, of all people, I thought you saw more." "I do see more," he whispered, stepping toward her again. "But I don't know how to help you without breaking the world around you." She closed her eyes. Her breath was shallow. "I don't want to be helped," she said. "I want to be heard." His voice was barely audible. "Then speak." And so she did. For the first time, she spoke freely. Of the night she arrived in America, small and fevered. Of the cold midwife who handed her off to a man who saw only profit. Of the endless silences. Of the cracked mirrors, the paint that never washed off fully, the applause that never meant affection. "I don't remember my mother's face," she said, "but I remember the way she smelled. Orange blossom. She used to hold me to her chest and hum, just low enough that I could feel it in my bones. I think sometimes that's the only real thing I ever knew." He stood still, every muscle taut with reverence. "I've spent so long believing I was no one," she whispered, "and now you come along and ask me who I am. You call me by my name like it matters." He reached for her hand. "I say your name," he murmured, "because it's the most honest word I've ever spoken." She trembled. His touch was soft, tentative, the barest brush against her fingers. He did not take, he did not press. He simply offered, and she let him. In the stillness of the ruined chapel, under the broken ribs of a ceiling that had once held sacred vows, she let herself believe, just for a moment, just for one night, that she was not something to be hidden, not something to be owned, but someone who could be loved. He raised her hand to his lips, not with hunger, but with awe. His breath was warm against her skin, and when his mouth touched her knuckles, she exhaled as though she'd been holding her breath for years. They did not kiss, not fully, but his forehead rested against hers, and that was more intimate than any possession. Time passed differently in that space. The night was slow, the rain gentle, the candles burned low. When it was time to go, she pulled away with care, her fingers lingering in his. "I don't belong to you," she said. "I know, but I wanted tonight to pretend I could." His eyes closed briefly. "You can," he said. She smiled, bittersweet. "You see me now," she whispered, "but one day they'll make you look away." "I won't." "You will," she said gently, "because they always do." And with that she slipped into the rain, her cloak billowing like a shadow. And Everett Langford remained alone in the chapel, the taste of her name on his lips and the weight of her truth upon his soul. Savannah glittered that night as though trying to dazzle away its sins. The governor's mansion stood alight like a jewel box cracked open, its wide verandas strung with lanterns that bobbed in the wind like fireflies caught in silver cages. The air pulsed with music, violins and cellos swirling in waltz time, and the scent of gardenia and beeswax drifted from the polished halls where society had come to parade itself beneath the sheen of wealth and lace. It was the governor's annual masquerade, a spectacle whispered about for weeks in the parlors of the city's elite. Invitations were printed on parchment imported from Paris. Gowns had been stitched in Charleston, hats commissioned from New York. The room bloomed with silks and velvets, powdered wigs and glittering masks. Laughter spilled like champagne, and secrets passed beneath fans like daggers wrapped in satin. Everett Langford stood near the fireplace, dressed in a charcoal tailcoat with silver embroidery along the lapels. His cravat was stiff, starched high beneath his chin, and a black half-mask shadowed the upper half of his face, lending him the air of a ghost returned to wander among the living. He had not wanted to come, but the pressure had grown louder by the hour. Letters from his solicitor, whispers from Savannah's matrons, invitations from eligible daughters cloaked in smiles too eager by half. He had been summoned here not as a guest, but as an exhibit. A widowed duke, foreign and wealthy, was a prize that no southern belle, or her ambitious mother, could ignore. They circled him now, some discreetly, others like swans in an ornamental lake, gliding too close with every turn of the waltz. He answered questions politely. He danced once, briefly. He sipped champagne he did not taste, but his gaze returned again and again to the arched entryway, waiting, though he would not admit it, even to himself. Outside, the rain had begun to fall again, soft and steady, as if the sky itself had tired of pretending. And then she came. She arrived without fanfare, without a carriage or escort, cloaked in midnight blue with the hood pulled low over her brow. The doorman hesitated, but her invitation, borrowed, stolen, or earned through whispered exchange, bore the proper seal. She passed through the marble foyer like a shadow, silent and unnoticed, a single white feather tucked between her gloved fingers. Inside, chandeliers shimmered above as music swelled. The room spun with light and color, but she moved through it like a secret not meant to be spoken. Her mask was delicate, a pale filigree of ivory that curved beneath her cheekbones and curled along her temple. Only her eyes remained uncovered, and they searched for one face. She saw him before he saw her. He was standing near the tall windows, one hand resting on his cane, the other holding a crystal glass. The mask did nothing to hide the ache in his posture. She did not hesitate. She walked directly into the center of the floor. He turned. Their eyes met. The world fractured. Everything else, lamplight, laughter, silk and shadow, fell away. There was only that look, that instant, that unspoken question hanging between them like a breath yet to be drawn. He set down his glass. She extended her hand. He took it. The music changed. An older piece, slower, sadder, as though the orchestra sensed something had entered the room that did not belong to this world. They moved into the center of the ballroom like sleepwalkers, not touching more than required, yet held together by something invisible, a gravity deeper than desire. Her gloved hand rested lightly on his shoulder. His palm hovered at the small of her back, barely grazing the fabric. But her heart beat so loudly beneath the corset, she feared the room would hear. He leaned in close enough that only she could hear. "Why did you come?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pressed the white feather into his palm, a reminder of who she was, of what they were. They danced, not well, not perfectly, but with the aching intimacy of two souls who had found each other in a world that would never permit it. His breath brushed her temple, her fingers curled against his chest. Their bodies never fully touched, yet the space between them pulsed with longing too precise to be mistaken. Around them, heads turned. The crowd began to murmur. A masked girl, a cloaked mystery, a foreign duke, dancing with no debutante, no heiress, but with someone no one recognized. And then it happened, a moment, a slip, a gust of wind through the open veranda. Her mask loosened, it fell, gasps broke like thunder. A silence swept the ballroom. Mireille froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the whispers started. "The circus girl! Is that her? The one with the mismatched eyes?" Everett stood very still. Mireille's breath caught. A man stepped forward, a senator's son, emboldened by wine and entitlement. "What is she doing here?" he spat, loud enough for all to hear. "This is a gathering of ladies." A few more joined, calling for her to be removed. Guards approached. She could have run. She could have wept. Instead, she straightened, her chin lifted, and with a voice clear, steady, and louder than the music had ever been, she said, "My name is Mireille Rousseau." The words hung in the air like fire. "I am not a spectacle. I am not a possession. I am not ashamed." She turned to Everett. And he, God help him, hesitated. It was only a second, But in that second, the weight of centuries pressed down on him. The title, the family, the legacy, the eyes of England, the eyes of Savannah, the voices in his blood that told him what was proper, what was allowed. He did not speak, he did not move, and she saw it, saw all of it. Her eyes, so full of bravery, flickered with something else, not betrayal, but confirmation. She was seized by two guards, rough hands on her arms. She did not struggle. She looked at him one last time, and what broke inside her was not hope. It was belief that he had been different, that he had seen her, and then they took her away. The ballroom closed behind her like a tomb, and Everett Langford remained rooted to the floor, the white feather still crumpled in his hand, the taste of her name still burning on his tongue. The night after the ball fell over Savannah like morning silk, silent, suffocating, unforgiving. The governor's mansion stood quiet now, its windows dark, its grand halls stripped of music and masks, but the echoes remained, of gasps, of scandal, of a name spoken aloud by a woman who was not meant to have one, Mireille Rousseau. The name still hung in the air like smoke. Outside the city, down a dirt path rarely traveled by gentry, a heavy carriage rolled through the blackness. It bore no insignia, no lanterns, no announcement of arrival. Only the groan of wheels and the snort of restless horses accompanied its passage through the trees. Inside, the air was thick with heat and shadows. Mireille sat on the floor of the carriage, her wrists raw from the rope that bound them. Her cheek split where a ringed hand had struck her hours before. Her cloak was gone. Her gown, once borrowed, once beautiful, was torn at the hem, stained with sweat and earth. Her hair clung to her neck, damp with blood from the shallow cut behind her ear. She did not cry, not when they dragged her from the ballroom, not when the guards whispered filth, not when the ringmaster arrived with eyes like black glass and said, "You've made quite the mess." Now, she stared through the wooden slats in the carriage wall, her breath shallow, her pride the only thing left unbruised. She had spoken her name, and still, they had taken her. The carriage would not return to the circus. No, she was being transported, quietly, without witnesses, to Charleston. There she would be sold again, this time not for spectacle but for ownership, to a wealthy man who had written discreetly. A collector of rarities, the ringmaster had said with a smile. Someone who appreciated obedience. "You're finished as an act," he had sneered, "but as a possession, you've only just begun." She had spit in his face, and for that, he had struck her. She touched her swollen lip now, not to soothe it, but to remember it. Each mile the carriage advanced felt like another name being taken from her, but her silence, now sharpened by defiance, remained. Back in Savannah, Everett Langford wandered his rented chambers like a man trapped in a dream he could not wake from. The ball still played in his mind, not as a memory, but as a punishment. The music, her hand in his, the mask slipping, her voice, calm, steady, filled with dignity and fire. "My name is Mireille Rousseau." He had heard it, all of them had, and he had done nothing. He replayed the moment over and over, the second where his feet had refused to move, where his voice had caught in his throat, where everything noble in him collapsed beneath the weight of fear, fear of disgrace, fear of inheritance, fear of choosing a woman the world would call unworthy. Now, he stood barefoot on the cold tile floor, his coat discarded, the buttons of his shirt torn from his own angry hands. The fire in the hearth crackled low. On the desk beside it, a thick parchment waited, its edges trimmed in gold, the seal of his estate pressed like a noose into the wax. The deed to his late wife's plantation. He stared at it, as one might stare at a dying animal. Then, without ceremony, he took it in both hands and held it over the flames. The parchment curled at the edges, blackened, and caught fire with a sound like a breath too long held. He watched it burn, not with triumph, with release. That night, by candlelight, he wrote the letter, No flourishes, no legalese, only the truth. To whom it may concern, disinherit me if you must. Let the estate rot in silence, let the title pass to dust. I choose truth, I choose Mireille Rousseau, and I will no longer apologize for seeing what the rest of you refuse to look at. You may erase my name from your books, but you will never erase hers from my heart. He folded it once, sealed it with plain wax, and sent it before sunrise. He did not sleep. Just before dawn there was a knock at his door, not urgent, just steady. He opened it and found no one, only a folded square of parchment resting on the stone step. No signature, no seal, only his name written in delicate script he knew too well. He brought it inside, unfolded it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single line, sewn in blue ink. You asked for my name. You should have fought for it. Beneath the words, wrapped in a strip of muslin, was the photograph. The one he had never seen in person. A little girl in white, standing beside a woman in embroidered silk. Mireille's eyes unmistakable, even then. One green, one grey-blue. Defiant even in youth. A name scrawled on the back, barely visible through age and wear. Daughter of R.L. Rousseau, France, 1820. He held it like a confession, and for the first time in his life, Everett Langford, Duke of Wexcombe, wept. Not for himself, but for the woman the world had locked in cages made of silk and shame. For the child who had been smuggled across oceans, erased and painted over. For the silence she had been forced to carry, and for the voice she had finally used. Too late for him to deserve it. As morning rose over the city, gilding the rooftops in quiet gold, Everett packed his satchel with little more than a coat, a pair of gloves, and the photograph. Then he walked out into the street, the white feather still in his breast pocket, and disappeared into the fog. The wind changed that night. It swept low across the Savannah River, colder than the season warranted, threading through alleys and canvas, with a whisper that curled around chimney pots and tugged at the stakes of the circus tents. It carried the scent of smoke before the flames were even visible. It murmured warnings in the trees, rattled shutters, and stirred lantern light into uneasy flickers. It was the eve of departure. The wagons were nearly packed. The horses, restless from the week's performances, stamped in their stalls. Final coins had been counted, contracts folded. Mireille's fate, sealed in silence and grease-stained paper, lay in a leather satchel by the ringmaster's desk, alongside a bill of transfer addressed to Charleston. She was to be delivered by dawn. No one had seen her since the night of the ball. Locked in one of the smaller caravans, gagged and bound for the first day, she had spent the next, in quiet solitude. She refused food. She refused threats. She refused to give them the satisfaction of brokenness. But she listened. She listened as boots passed outside the door, as the tent stakes were pulled, as the scent of kerosene grew stronger and the air more brittle. And then, at midnight, she moved. No one saw her leave. The caravan door had not been forced. The lock had not been broken, but the inside of the door, it was later discovered, bore the faint smear of candle wax and soot, tools known only to those who live among shadows. Some say the first flames began near the tiger's cage. Others swear they saw sparks from a lantern kicked over by a careless boy. But a few, those who watched from the edge of the trees, would whisper for years that they saw a figure in a dark cloak, barefoot and swift, slip from behind the kitchens with a matchbook clutched tight. The fire spread quickly, too quickly. It danced across the canvas like a hungry thing, devouring banners and props, licking at the ropes, swallowing the sideshows whole. The animals panicked, thrashed in their cages. The wind turned to heat. Screams rose through the smoke. The circus, that glorious illusion of power and wonder, cracked open like an overripe fruit. The lion's cage was found open. The ledger tent collapsed in a pillar of flame. By the time the ringmaster awoke, the ground beneath his boots was already ash. No one knows if he fled, or if the flames claimed him too. Everett Langford had not slept. He had wandered the riverbank at dusk, then returned to his room, only to pace again. The note she had left, the one that said he should have fought, lay folded in his coat pocket, worn now at the edges from being touched, reread, clutched like a prayer. When the bells began to ring, low and uneven, he felt it in his chest before he heard it with his ears. He ran, out into the streets, through smoke-sweetened air, past the startled cries of vendors and the frantic bells of firemen. The sky above the circus glowed orange-red, a living wound against the indigo night. Sparks rained down like stars. He called her name again and again, but no one answered. The crowd swelled. Some screamed, some cheered. There were those who always hated the circus, those who called it cursed. But Everett pushed past them all, coat torn open, boots slick with mud and soot. The tents were collapsing in waves. He saw performers running, some with pets, some with nothing, but not her. Not her. He searched until his lungs burned. And then, just before dawn, he saw her. Far beyond the edge of the fairgrounds, near the marshlands where the reeds grew tall and the river widened into stillness, she stood barefoot in the soft earth, her cloak singed at the hem, her hair wild and tangled with ash. In her arms, she held a scorched birdcage, its metal bent, its door open. Inside, only soot and feather fragments remained. Her feet were bloodied, her hands scraped raw, but she stood tall, like a woman reborn from flame. Everett stopped. He didn't rush forward. He didn't speak at once. He simply looked at her, this woman who had once danced in silence and now stood in the ruins of her cage with smoke on her skin and dignity in her bones. She turned slowly, as though expecting him. Their eyes met. And in that instant, there was no title between them, no past, no shame, only choice. He walked to her without a word, his steps careful, his breath uneven. When he reached her, he dropped to his knees, not in reverence, but in surrender. He looked up at her, hands open. "I won't ask you to come with me," he said, voice hoarse with smoke and grief, "but I will follow you anywhere, if you'll let me." She said nothing, only looked at him. Then, without drama, without trembling, she reached into the pocket of her cloak and pulled free the photograph. She held it out. He took it. The edges were curled, the ink nearly worn away. But the girl in the image, solemn, strange, seen, still stared back. She placed her hand over his, gently closing his fingers around the image. Then, for the first time, she smiled. Not with joy, with peace. He rose. They stood together, alone in the quiet, with the flames behind them and the river before them. The cage had burned, the silence had been broken, and something fragile, improbable but real had begun to live. The wind had the taste of salt and memory. It came rolling off the grey-blue sea, tugging at the hedgerows and whispering across the tall grass that crowned the cliffs. Along the winding lanes of the English coast, gulls circled the sky like white-tipped prayers, their cries echoing over the surf. Far below, the tide slid in and out with the soft patience of time, smoothing stones and carving away old shapes to make room for new ones. Nestled at the edge of the village stood a house of faded stone and bright windows, its chimney breathing pale smoke into the afternoon sky. It was not grand. It had never been. But inside its walls, something sacred had begun to grow. Laughter, paper rustling, a hand raised to ask a question, a woman's voice, calm and steady, answering with tenderness and certainty. In the second-floor room that had once held crates of coal, desks had been built from salvaged planks, each with a dented inkwell and a crooked stool. On the chalkboard, someone had drawn a crude but joyful bird with its wings outstretched. The floor creaked with every step and the ceiling leaked in spring, but no one complained, because she was there. Mireille Rousseau, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her skirt dusted with chalk, her hands ink-stained and certain. The children called her Madame Rousseau, not because they were instructed to, but because something in her manner made anything less feel unworthy. She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. She taught with a gentleness that did not hide its firmness. Letters and numbers were taught alongside stories, some pulled from books, others stitched from memory. She never spoke of the circus, nor of fire, nor of feathers, but she spoke of wind, of birds, of names, and the children listened. Each morning she arrived before the fire was lit, and each evening she remained after the last candle had burned low, copying lessons by hand for the next day. Her desk bore no photograph, no trinkets, but in the drawer, wrapped in muslin, was a folded image that she touched only when alone. The girl she had once been, the ghost who once danced in silence. 1 year had passed, and she was no longer haunted. Everett arrived just past midday, as he did every Thursday. His coat carried the scent of book paper and worn leather, his collar always slightly askew, as if the wind refused to let him be polished. He no longer walked like a duke. His stride was slower now, gentler at the edges. The children adored him. He never scolded. He asked questions that made them think, and he listened to every answer like it mattered. He brought her tea, as always, in a chipped porcelain cup wrapped in a wool sleeve. And she, without looking, reached for it the moment he set it down. "You're late," she said softly, without turning from the chalkboard. He grinned. "Henry fed my lesson to the fire grate. I warned you not to let him near your Shakespeare. I thought I could win him over with Macbeth. I was wrong." She turned then. Their eyes met, and for a moment the room stilled. There was no fire between them, no urgency, only quiet knowing. The children rushed in after the bell, storming the room like a gale, and the hour dissolved in laughter, questions, the scratching of quills, the creak of wooden chairs. And when the lesson ended, and the last child had wandered out with a crust of bread and a book under one arm, they remained. The room dimmed as the sun fell behind the cliffs, casting golden light through the dusty panes. Everett gathered the loose papers from the floor. Mireille packed away the books. He reached for the journal on her desk, the one bound in soft leather, filled with lesson plans and odd bits of poetry, and she let his fingers brush the edge before taking it from him. "Walk with me," she asked. They made their way down the path that curved along the cliff's edge, the sea to one side, the open moor behind. The wind toyed with the edges of her shawl. His fingers itched to fix it, but he didn't. Not yet. At the edge of the rocks, they sat. Below them, the waves broke gently against the shore. The light had turned amber now, the sky glowing with the last breath of day. Mireille opened her journal and tucked the photograph inside, between pages stained with ink and pressed violets. She closed the book with care and held it to her chest for a moment before setting it beside her on the bench. "Do you think she would be proud of me?" she asked, not looking at him. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her profile, the way the wind lifted a loose curl at her temple, the way her hands, those same hands that had once trembled behind a curtain, now rested with quiet authority in her lap. "I think," he said at last, "she would say you were never painted." She turned. He met her gaze, only waiting to be seen. Her breath caught, not in shock, not in sorrow, in recognition. She reached for his hand, not out of need, but of choice. Their fingers entwined. The waves continued below. The gulls wheeled above, and the sky shifted from gold to lavender to quiet blue. Mireille closed her eyes, not in fear, not in flight, but in peace. The wind brushed her cheek, no longer cold, no longer harsh. She was no longer the painted bird. She was Mireille Rousseau, and she was finally free. The sea had not changed. It still rolled in soft, tireless waves along the English coast, brushing the cliffs with ancient patience. The air still carried salt and stories. But the wind no longer whispered of endings. Now it hummed of roots, of things that had stayed. The house on the hill had aged gently. Its shutters bore new paint, pale blue against grey stone. A garden bloomed where only thistle had once grown, and vines now curled around the gate like hands learning to hold. Laughter echoed often, high, bright, familiar. In the schoolroom, the desks were smaller now, built with smoother wood. A new chalkboard stretched across the back wall, and the old bird, once drawn by eager fingers, had been carefully preserved in the corner, untouched for years. She was there, Mireille. Her hair was longer now, often tied in a loose knot at the nape of her neck. Fine lines had gathered around her eyes, but they had come not from sorrow, from sun, from laughter, from living. She moved with the calm authority of someone who had earned every moment of peace. They called her Madame Langford now, though she still signed her name Mireille Rousseau when she wrote her own letters. The name had never been about marriage. It had always been about truth. Outside, on the path near the moor, Everett walked toward the schoolhouse, his coat open, his collar soft with wear. His beard had grown in at the chin, flecked now with silver, but his eyes had not dulled. If anything, they had grown clearer. He still brought her tea, though she teased that his brewing had not improved in 8 years. He carried a parcel beneath his arm, a stack of essays from the older students. Their little school had grown, expanding room by room, year by year. It welcomed orphans, laborers' children, and more recently, the daughters of tradesmen once too proud to send girls to learn. Society had shifted slowly, but it had shifted. A woman who taught was no longer strange. A duke without title was no longer scandal. A marriage built on something deeper than fortune was no longer invisible. They had married quietly, not for spectacle, for sanctuary. The ceremony had been held under a sycamore tree, with only the children and the wind in attendance. There had been no vows louder than their glances, no jewels brighter than the feather she had tucked into her braid. And then came Lucien. He was 7 now, a boy of ink-stained hands and impossible questions. He had his mother's stillness and his father's stubbornness, and he had once declared at the dinner table that he intended to build a school for birds who cannot fly. Mireille had wept that night, not for sorrow, for the wonder of it. There had been loss, too, as life demands. One winter, a letter arrived from Savannah, unsigned but unmistakable. The ringmaster had died in a fire not of her making, his body found alone, surrounded by ledgers and locked cages. No heirs, no mourners. Everett had burned the letter without comment. Mireille had lit a candle, and they had both stood at the window for a long time, hand in hand, watching the wind carry the smoke into the sea. Others had written too, women from the troop. One had left to care for her sister, another opened a bakery, one had married a sailor. They thanked her, quietly, humbly, because somehow after the fire, their stories had begun again too. And the photograph, the one that had once lived folded in parchment, now hung framed in the upstairs hallway. The little girl in the white smock stared out from her place between lesson charts and childish paintings. Her eyes mismatched, her chin lifted. Lucien had once asked who she was. She was me, Mireille had said. But smaller, he'd asked. She had smiled. No, my love, not smaller, just forgotten, for a little while. That evening, the three of them walked to the cliff's edge. The sun was beginning to fall, casting gold across the fields. Everett carried Lucien on his shoulders. Mireille walked beside them, her shawl pulled tight, her journal tucked under her arm. They sat where they always had, on the same bench, facing the sea. And as the sky burned rose and lavender, Mireille opened her journal once more, ran her fingers across the worn leather, and whispered something only the wind heard. Everett turned to her. "Still writing?" he asked. "Always," she replied. He smiled, and in the silence that followed, nothing needed to be said. She had flown once from cages, from silence, from shame, but now she remained not because she had to, but because she had chosen. And the wind, ever faithful, carried her name far and wide, not as a rumor, not as a warning, but as a song. Some stories are not loud. They do not arrive with trumpets or triumph. They unfold quietly, like the slow unfurling of a name long forgotten, or the gentle blooming of a heart once kept in shadow. Mireille Rousseau was not born a heroine. She was shaped by fire, by silence, by the weight of a world that never asked her who she was, only what she could endure. But she taught us that freedom is not always found in escape. Sometimes it begins the moment we choose to speak, the moment we believe we deserve to be seen. And Everett Langford, who once wore a title like armor, learned that love is not proven in grand gestures, but in presence, in standing still beside someone when the world would have you walk away. This story is about courage, the kind that lives in the soft-spoken, the overlooked, the caged. It is about reclaiming your name, even when the world has tried to erase it. And now I turn to you. If the painted bird moved something in you, if you felt even one heartbeat align with Mireille's, I'd love for you to tell us. What did this journey mean to you? To show you've flown with us to the very last page, leave the word freedom in the comments. It's a simple word, but now it carries weight. And if you wish to help keep stories like this alive, stories that honor emotion, that celebrate resilience, consider sending a super thanks. Any amount you feel comfortable with will help us create more heartfelt journeys like Mireille's. We are endlessly grateful for every gesture, no matter how small. And if support isn't possible right now, know that simply sharing this story with someone who loves historical romance, resilience, or quiet strength is also a powerful gift. Your voice helps these voices be heard. I've left a few other beautiful emotional tales linked in the cards. Stories of women who rise, of love that waits, of truth that refuses to stay buried. I hope you'll stay with us a little longer. Thank you for feeling, for listening, and for remembering. Because sometimes the smallest act, one comment, one share, one truth, can set someone free.